Internet and digital technologies that create cyberspace are transforming society, business, and politics. People respond to new opportunities online, react to cyber threats, and change their behaviour accordingly. States compete with each other and, as we now know, are increasingly weaponizing information to gain advantage, breaking into other countries' networks to steal data, seed misinformation, or disrupt critical infrastructure. Here to discuss these issues with me is Ciaran Martin, Professor of Practice at the Blavatnik School of Government, University of Oxford, and formerly the founding Chief Executive of the UK National Cybersecurity Centre, a man who led a fundamental shift in the UK approach to cybersecurity. I can think of few better qualified conversation partners for today's discussion, which is part of the online discussion series on topical foreign and security policy issues, the Lennart Meri conference talks. Ciaran, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you so much, Merle.
Excellent. Perhaps then we could start by looking back and looking forward. Over the past 5 years, we have seen NATO declare cyberspace as a separate military domain. We have witnessed interference in the US presidential elections in 2016, as well as the French presidential elections in 2017. We've seen an increasing volume of attacks against critical information infrastructure, like the WannaCry and NotPetya, and now, more recently, we have the Microsoft Exchange and SolarWinds attacks at hand. So how has the cyber threat picture changed in recent years, and how do you expect it to develop in the future?
Well, it's interesting to focus on things that have changed and things that haven't. And sitting somewhere as you are in Estonia, a small country, highly digitized and on Russia's border, it probably feels like there has been a stable and increasing and consistent nation-state threat for many years, given Russia's long history of cyber attacks in its near its own borders. But I think the situation has evolved. There are grounds for optimism. I mean, if you look back 10, 20 years, look at the warnings about cyber war, cyber catastrophe. Look at what happened in Estonia in 2007. People said this would be the new normal. This sort of thing would be happening all the time. And actually it hasn't. So we've seen cybersecurity evolve into a pernicious threat to everyday life, and what I sometimes call the aggregation of small harms into large-scale national and international problems. So let me break it down a little bit. One thing that I think we underestimated was the sheer power of rampant international criminality. A lot of it's based out of Russia, but not all of it. And it is very debilitating. It's got no political objective. It just wants to make money. But during a pandemic, when we saw ransomware hit hospitals in the US and across Europe and so forth, it really brought home that you don't have to have a political motive to cause real harm in cyberspace. So that's one thing. I think a second evolving pattern, you mentioned NotPetya and WannaCry, is the sheer ability of these attacks to go wrong. I mean, they were the two most difficult attacks to deal with in my time in office. They both caused substantial disruption and financial and economic harm in the United Kingdom, and neither of them were targeted at the UK. North Korea seemed to be behind WannaCry, and its targets were finance in Asia. Russia was behind NotPetya, and its target appeared to be business in Ukraine, but as well as disrupting London advertising agencies, to my knowledge, disrupted production at a chocolate factory in Tasmania. So I think it just shows that you don't have to be targeted. But I think I think there's one big sort of stable and consistent aspect to this, and two big changes. The stable and consistent aspect, it has become a theatre for great power conflict, but well below the threshold of war and well below the threshold of things that would trigger interventions. So if you mentioned SolarWinds, large-scale traditional espionage done very cleverly, and so on. If you look back 6-7 years at the Chinese stealing the American federal government security clearance database, you look at all the pre-positioning you find on critical infrastructure. You look at perhaps the tests of destructive capability, as with TV Saint Monde and so forth in France 5-6 years ago. So that's a sort of consistent part where there is this sort of theatre of low level but strategically important harassment. I think the two things that have evolved, one you mentioned, is the disinformation campaigns, the meddling in others' democratic processes. I do think we need to be a little bit circumspect about the success we attribute to that. I mean, clearly the intervention in the US was very powerful, and America still talks about it, which was the objective. The intervention in France doesn't seem to have been terribly well executed, not least because it happened on the day when the French, before the elections, when the French media are prohibited by law from reporting anything. So it didn't seem to be a terribly effective operation. I think any operations the Russians have conducted in the political space against the UK have been pretty ineffective as well. So intent is there, but impact isn't always there. And I think we don't want to undermine confidence in our own democratic systems by overstating the impact of these Russian operations. But if I had to call out one seismic change, it's that competition in cyberspace is moving from essentially who's winning on the digital domain created by the American private sector, which is what we've been talking about for the last 20 or 30 years. You know, the digital domain that you mentioned, that NATO has declared a separate domain of operations, is essentially one built by America. And that's worked for us in Europe because we're all allies, and it's consistent with our free and open values. But there's now a competing model from China, not from Russia. Russia is good at undermining our own sense of security and freedom on the American internet, but China's building its own and it's exporting it. And even if it doesn't export it successfully, because I don't think excluding it from the West is the top priority, it's making sure ours is competitive with it. China's objective is to have better technology than us, because I think it looks at the lesson of the West-Soviet Cold War. The West won because it was economically more successful. China wants to be economically more successful, so we have to keep competing and innovating. So who owns cyberspace and who runs it and who designs it is going to be as important as keeping ourselves safe in it. That's the one big change in the future.
Indeed. Speaking of Russia and China, I was wondering how would you get into that a bit more in detail? How are our adversaries thinking and acting there? Like, what are they thinking? What is Russia and China? I mean, the two countries that are responsible for the most damaging cyber attacks. How are they thinking about it? What motivates them?
I think their motivations and the way they think about it are quite different. I hesitate to try to define Russia's motives to someone from Estonia, to an expert from Estonia, because I think you'll have a much deeper and more direct experience of it than I would. But I think Russia's motives in cyberspace have tended to be fairly traditionally geopolitical. Russia is in many respects a declining power, population, economy. It's got all sorts of problems, but it has some strengths, and clearly skill and aptitude in cyber attack is one of those strengths. And so Russia is seeking to affirm its own power by prepositioning, affirm its own strategic advantage by spying, and also undermine its opponents and enemies by, as we've discussed, perhaps trying to interfere in free political discourse and undermining democracy. So in a sense, it's about the projection of Russian aims via digital means. China, I've always thought, is quite different. My view is the roots of the Chinese capability in cyberspace is fundamentally economic. China started out its cyber hacking of the West, certainly the UK. There was a little bit of traditional espionage involved, but a lot of it was about stealing intellectual property as part of the rapid economic development of the country in the first decade of this century. So the routes have been very, very different. It was noisier than Russia's because there was no need to be particularly stealthy when you were just stealing intellectual property. There was no need to be particularly sophisticated because the networks weren't very well defended, and there wasn't any particular need to avoid detection because it was very hard to impose consequences. That's changed a bit, but as I said, I think China is now seeing this as part of a whole much bigger strategy about technological supremacy. In fact, when I think reflecting on my last year or two in office, Chinese cyber attacks, as we traditionally thought about them, were just business as usual. Trying to think about how free and open society could accommodate or not Chinese technology, and how to think about how to protect innovation in free and open Western technology was a lot harder than dealing with just keeping out hackers.
True, true. Well, over the past months, we've seen news has broken about Russia and China having both conducted major cyber attacks and operations against the networks, against the American government as well as many companies. I'm talking about the SolarWinds attack and the Microsoft Exchange hack. So why do you think that sort of things keep on happening?
Well, I think they keep on happening because our digital infrastructure is too weakly secured. So there are targets there. But I think the SolarWinds hack by the Russians and the Microsoft Exchange hack by the Chinese actually show the different approaches of the two countries. So SolarWinds was classic stealthy digital espionage. And these differences matter because in terms of the response from the West, we have to be clear what we're responding to. I think SolarWinds is a very difficult thing for the West to respond to, for the United States to respond to, because it was the sort of intelligence operation that Western intelligence agencies routinely do. It was a strategic setback, but clearly there was a supply chain compromise which gave wide accesses to the Russians, but they only used a few of them and they closed the rest off so that nobody else could use them. They selected the high value targets that you might expect, the US government departments, important technological companies and so forth. They stayed there for as long as they could without detection, presumably exfiltrating as much information as they could. And I think they were there for about 9 months. And when the door was closed on them, off they went. And that's how classic digital espionage has worked. So it's, I think in terms of SolarWinds, America and its allies were harmed by it, but not particularly wronged by it, if you know what I mean. You know, that is, I don't think most experts see any, if there were an agreed set of norms in cyberspace, this wouldn't really have crossed any of them, at least as they currently exist. On the other hand, the Chinese compromise of Microsoft Exchange looks a lot more indiscriminate. The targets are much more numerous. I mean, I think Microsoft are talking about 400,000 affected servers earlier this week, of which 82,000 remained unpatched at the time that we are talking. They're not high value targets. A lot of them will be small businesses that haven't got around or haven't been able to afford going to the cloud. And once the door was closed on them, they sort of booby trapped the infrastructure by leaving these so-called web shells or backdoors that anybody could attack. So I think a lot of our friends in the US are now worried about uptick in ransomware and other criminal activity. And I think that shows, again, some of the Chinese attacks have been less disciplined. They've been more economic or just opportunistic than some of the Russian ones. And in that respect, perhaps pose more of a threat to the integrity of the digital infrastructure that we're using than the Russian hack.
I agree. I think better data management and data analytical tools are now available, and these let different kinds of intelligence agencies to manage huge pots of data. Expanding on the SolarWinds attack, Ciaran, to be provocative, do you believe that cyber espionage campaigns exist that are acceptable under existing international law and norms? In a way, if they were limited in scope, carefully executed, and not designed to destroy, manipulate, or otherwise disrupt data. In that sense, where I'm getting at is Russia standing alone in this, or are all major intelligence agencies actually doing the same thing, something like that?
Well, I think in SolarWinds specifically, one can make a strong case that it didn't violate any sorts of norms, and certainly where the US and the Five Eyes, and I sat on the board of a Five Eyes intelligence agencies for 6.5 years. In my first year, I had to sign a bunch of court documents in response to legal challenges after the Snowden leaks, which essentially said, digital espionage responsibly done involves large-scale access, is often through supply chain compromises. That gives you access to a large number of targets, but you whittle them down responsibly, and you only you only get the information you need, and you examine it carefully, and that's all adjudicated under independently arbitrated rule of law courts and so forth. And in SolarWinds, all of that applies, apart from the last bit. I don't think we would see Russia's courts and oversight as independent, or and so forth. So in SolarWinds, I think you can, based on the evidence we have at the moment, you can say that no norms were violated. However, Russia in general has gone beyond what I would see and many others would see as acceptable norms. So if you go back to the 2016 hack of the Democratic Party in the US and Secretary Clinton's campaign, you can look at that in two phases. And phase one was a bit like SolarWinds. I mean, Secretary Clinton was, at the time, as we will remember, widely assumed to be a near certainty to become the next president of the United States. So it would be pretty extraordinary if the Russian state wasn't spying on her, and I don't think that many people would have complained that they were. It's what you'd expect. The activity that then breached norms was, once they got the information, they then did a data dump designed to cause maximum interference with the free campaign in the US. That's a violation of norms, and clearly in other hacks they've done, they have violated norms by disrupting infrastructure in Ukraine, by what they did in Estonia all those years ago, and so forth. So just because this hack, which I think it's also interesting for real criminologists. Of course, this was the SVR, it is believed, whereas it's the other ones are all FSB. And the SVR has no post-Soviet history of doing anything other than just spying, whereas the FSB has all sorts of post-Soviet history of doing all sorts of things that we would that we would disapprove of. So I do think that there is something there about this, and I think it poses a hard question. I mentioned earlier that we are talking about essentially the American internet, and the rules were set by the West, by the US in particular. And if you want to make the case that things like large-scale digital espionage a la SolarWinds are inappropriate, then that poses some very hard questions for the West as well. But I would welcome a debate on that. I don't have a fixed view, because I do think, you mentioned NATO correctly classifying cyberspace as a separate domain, but I also think of cyberspace as an environment. I mean, it's what we're talking over now. It's what's keeping this event going. It's what's kept most events and businesses going in the last year during the pandemic. It's where we're increasingly living and working. So in some respect, I like to place militaristic and military strategy language about cyberspace in a secondary position. Primarily, I think about it as an environment of peaceful human activity. And cyber campaigns and intrusions are pollutants in that environment, but sometimes they're necessary. But you do have to ask hard questions about what sort of digital environment do you want, and that involves asking ourselves hard questions about how far are we prepared to corrupt the environment in pursuit of our own national security.
Absolutely, and I very much agree about your thinking of it. Very much depends on with the data theft. It very much depends on where the stolen data goes and what you do with the stolen data. Certainly, data can be monetized, and the more data sets, the better it is to do that. But there is a difference whether stealing the last 4 digits of a bank account of, I don't know, 100 million users, or to steal, for example, the security clearance forms of 1 million officials. Could you think of a case where data theft has really caused strategic harm, just as we've seen now with the SolarWinds hack?
The one standout case is when the Chinese People's Liberation Army is believed to have stolen the entire database of the Office of Personnel Management in the United States. So to you and me, that's essentially the Civil Service Department. And it was the security clearance database. Now, I don't know if you've ever been, Merle, to the haveibeenpwned.com website run by an Australian cybersecurity researcher, Troy Hunt. And it's brilliant. You type in your email and it says your email, and one of my old government email appears on it 12 times. things like the LinkedIn compromise way back in 2012 and so forth. But I know what data is there, and it's an out-of-date email address, an out-of-date password, and there's no bank cards. Other data has got the last 4 digits of a bank card, which is monetizable but not hugely useful and not a huge direct threat to me. Security clearance form, on the other hand, I filled them in. I know what the American one looks like. It's absolutely everything you can think of. Primary identifiers, secondary identifiers, embarrassing personal history, or everything. It's a treasure trove. So walking off with the database of anyone who'd applied and served in the US federal government in the first 14 years of the century was a huge strategic setback. I think DNI Clapper at the time, the Director of National Intelligence, General Clapper, acknowledged it as such. And I do remember, and we all felt for them, American friends and colleagues, as we worked with them, feeling that the pain that they felt, knowing that their personal data was in the hands of an adversarial nation, and in practical terms, things like their mother's birth name and so forth that were commonly used as secondary identifiers were no longer valid as secondary identifiers. So large-scale data breaches can be strategically damaging, and that, I think, is the classic case.
Thank you. Indeed, I think we both agree that cyber attacks can have serious impact on national security. On the other hand, Thomas Reid, I think, whom you've quoted in different occasions, Thomas Reid, in his book "Cyber War Will Not Take Place," argues against the overly militarization of the debate about cyber attacks, and in particular the confusing of use of analogies referring to the Cold War and nuclear deterrence. Thomas Reid believes that too much hype about cyber Armageddon can detracts you from the real cyber imperatives. Do you disagree with it?
No, I agree. In fact, viewers will think we set this up, but I can actually touch Cyber War Will Not Take Place because it's on my desk right now. And the reason for that, it's certainly one of the most important books about cyber, the cyber domain ever written. And it's one of my favorites, if not my all-time favorite, and I think it's profoundly valuable. And actually, it's reflected in the approach of the National Cybersecurity Centre in the UK that I was lucky enough to be able to pioneer. So let's talk about that Chinese hack of the Office of Personnel Management again. I mean, no one was hurt. It's a strategic setback. It wasn't glamorous. It was not. If you look at what we sometimes call the Cybergeddon videos that are used in marketing for cybersecurity companies, or have been used in Hollywood films going back to War Games back in 1984 with Matthew Broderick, it doesn't conform to any of those stereotypes. In fact, some of my American friends, cybersecurity experts, call this the sort of pew-pew aspect of cyber war, where you've got these great big maps of the world and people are firing at this and that and so forth, and the data are largely meaningless coming from that. Thomas, I think, is right that cyber he talks about it, it's about sabotage, espionage, and subversion. I think that's broadly correct. It doesn't directly harm, even in industrial control systems, it doesn't directly harm the people controlling them. And as we saw, for example, you may have seen there was an attempt to hack and alter the chemical composition of drinking water in Florida earlier this year. And what happened there was that nothing to do with cyber defenses. There's a pH regulatory check before the water goes out, and the interference was already noticed before that. So there are a whole bunch of, it's a bit like during the 5G debate in the UK. People were saying, well, what if there's a cyber attack? The answer to that is, are you ever going to get into a car where the only thing stopping you crashing into the other car is the maintenance of a phone connection? There have to be some other safety and security checks. I was once part of a UK government exercise which talked about what happens if a hostile state took out the railway signalling system. They said to me, well, what happens? I said, my first question is for the Department of Transport. What's that? I said, well, if the signalling system goes out, which of the following two scenarios happen? Number one, the trains continue and collide into each other, causing mass fatalities. Or number two, the trains stop in the middle of nowhere, causing mass inconvenience. Both are very bad, but the second one was substantially better than the first one, and that is, of course, what happened. So I think the value of the Thomas Rid book on cyber war will not take place, is that it demythologizes these risks and talks about cyber contests for what they actually are. And if we mythologize this, if we spread this fear and ignorance about what malevolent cyber activity is really like, we don't defend well against it. We spend fortunes building up against these non-existent catastrophic threats. And we don't then look at supply chain compromises. We don't look at resilience measures, which are crucially important. So I think ultimately, whether it's a nation state elite unit or whether it's protecting against criminal ransomware, cybersecurity is about risk management. And it's about solid, pragmatic defensive measures to improve the security of the digital environment. And so it's a very, very valuable book with which I profoundly agree.
Thank you. I also like that book a lot. And I agree with you. I mean, currently, when we look at the talks in Washington as a reaction to both of the hacks, there is a lot of talk about preparing for retaliation. The US National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, tweeted that the White House was closely tracking reports of the latest breach, a sign that the administration is taking the issue very seriously. We've seen a US senator who has described the SolarWinds attack as an act of war, while others have disagreed. But it illustrates how rhetoric about cyber campaigns is escalating, heightening the pressure for tough action. Do you think this tough action leads us to a successful sort of status, or will it actually escalate things even further?
Well, 3 quick points. Firstly, the administration, the Biden administration, has never described SolarWinds as an act of war, as you said, some senators have. And it isn't an act of war. And to say it is in my view, grossly irresponsible and fear-mongering, and would also, as a consequence, implicate the US, the rest of the Five Eyes, and many Western European nations in similar acts of war, because it's a digital espionage campaign. So it's not an act of war. However, it is something that the administration clearly feels it needs to respond to, just like when, in the pre-digital days, when large-scale spy rings were discovered from the Soviet Union and the US, they tried to do something about it to deter it happening in future. But often that wasn't, retaliating via cyber means, I think in this case, is very, very difficult, because what are they going to do? I mean, they're not going to harm civilians, because that would be utterly disproportionate and wildly illegal, and no responsible ally would support it. They could try and hack back into some Russian spying infrastructure, and no doubt they will do, but that can be quite hard because these are elite organizations with good defenses. So they might try more diplomatic or economic means and so forth. But having said that, despite the fact I think there's a lot of rhetoric about imposing costs and so forth, firstly, it's really quite hard to do. There's an imbalance between free, open, highly digitized Western societies and authoritarian, not terribly digitized dictatorships like Russia in terms of imposing costs. So I think for all the talk, the response to SolarWinds, for all those reasons, will be relatively modest. What will be interesting will be the response to the Microsoft Exchange hack, because if it is the case that irresponsible activity by Chinese state hackers leads to a surge in criminal ransomware attacks on American business, then that's a different problem. And again, I don't think, certainly I'd very much hope and doubt that the US would start attacking Chinese civilians through kinetic cyber attacks, and that's not the way it works. This is very much in the Thomas Rid. We're not heading for a cyber war here, but I think that in terms of the totality of US-China relations, if it is the case, if it does prove to be the case that irresponsible Chinese hacking leads to severe economic disruption for US businesses at a terribly tough time with the pandemic, then I think you would expect a broad-based response to that, whether that's economic, whether it's indictments, diplomatic, and so on.
Ciaran, do you think that all this talk about retaliation takes the focus away from the actual task at hand, improving our own cyber resilience? Because there is a technical aspect in hardening defenses and building redundancy in data and services, but the core of resilience is leadership that does not ignore the problem. What worries you about our own resilience, and where do you see gaps there?
Well, firstly, Merle, I think what you said in your question is profoundly important. Yes, I do agree that all this talk of retaliation does detract from the fundamental mission, which is to improve our own digital hygiene. I think in cyberspace, the best form of defense is defense. I think that digital retaliation is very difficult for all the reasons we've been talking about, and that escalatory rhetoric in response to cyber hacks doesn't often achieve a great deal. I think that our technology evolved in the last 25, 30 years in a way that left it structurally insecure in many ways. It was nobody's fault, it just happened that way. A series of services emerging out of companies on the west coast of America implied that you needed to give your data away in exchange for free access to web-based services. As some of the people involved at the time, like Vint Cerf, who was the legendary Google figure, has said, at the time we didn't focus enough on people who'd want to break the system. And the most valuable thing we can do is improve the quality of software, and in security terms, improve the quality of hardware, incentivize those improvements. Because at the minute, what is the commercial incentive for people to write safer software, for people to build safer hardware? There aren't just sort of commercial incentives to do security well that there are in, say, automobiles. And there's a huge incentive to build safe cars because people, first of all, unsafe cars, most countries don't allow them on the road. And secondly, most people will pay a bit more for cars that are provably safer. We need to do the same thing. Then there's the resilience point. I think that's a profoundly important point. It's not the same point as security, but as head of the National Cybersecurity Centre in the UK, in the 4 years I was there, I think we dealt with 2,500 incidents that we deemed serious enough to merit our involvement. I can't think of any of them where the primary preoccupation of the principal victim was not keeping going. I don't care how I keep this organization going, I need to keep it going. Yes, I'm interested in who attacked me and why, but that can wait for another day. I need to keep my banking services going, my shop going, my government department going, and so on. So that resilience piece and that connection, no cyber risk exists in isolation, nor should it. And no organization will ever be primarily about cybersecurity. In government, a health department will be looking after health services in the middle of a pandemic. It needs to be cyber secure, but it can't primarily focus on it. So we have to work out, if something happened in cyberspace to the healthcare system, what happens instead? Where are the patients going to go? How are we going to make sure that the logistics of a complicated healthcare system work? The same thing happens in food retail and so forth. So it's the most profoundly important thing we can do is raise our digital hygiene. Because the other thing I've noticed is that whether it's a criminal, and we looked at large-scale criminal cyber enterprises, whether it's criminal or whether it's a nation state at the top of their game, they look for the easiest targets. And even if they're looking at a specific target, they'll look for the easiest way into that target. So in terms of criminality, if a country makes itself a little bit safer than another country, the criminals will go to the other country. And if a network makes itself safer against, say, Russian state espionage, then at least that will lessen the overall harm caused because they'll have to work harder, which means they won't be able to do something else. So every little bit of increased cybersecurity helps. it's a public good. I think we need to start thinking about cybersecurity not just as something we need to do for ourselves, but as a national and international public good for our own countries and our allies.
Definitely, and I agree that cyber hygiene or the digital hygiene is something very important, and we definitely take it very, very seriously here in Estonia. But ultimately, it's a little bit of a preventive measure, whereas I very much agree with your point that we need to make sure that our services, our society, and especially the critical infrastructure keeps on going also when under attack. How do you think we can best prepare for that? How keen of a believer are you in different war games and technical exercises for the technical people, and how to increase the awareness at the political level? Because when crisis hits, you need management and politicians to be able to make decisions. How can we best prepare for that? Is it exercises and training?
Well, I think one of the many things I hugely admire about Estonia is the way it's got digital strategy and cybersecurity working in parallel. A lot of countries embark on large-scale digitalization of public services, and they forget about security, and then they realize, oh, there's a big security risk here, and then they overcompensate and the services become hard to use. I think Estonia's got it right. It became from a very low starting point. It became one of the most digitized countries in the world, but did so in a way that brought security with it in a risk managed way. I mean, because I've seen, at firsthand, Estonians use public services, and it's remarkably convenient, but yet the standards of security are really good, and that's a good model of risk management. So that's one thing. A second thing is that I think, when you get this in a small number of mostly small countries, you get it in Estonia, you get it in Singapore, you get it in Israel, you get leaders who are conversant in this stuff. So it's not just about the technical people. In fact, the technical people aren't really the problem. It's about the technical people talking in a way that the senior decision takers can understand. So again, in the UK, when I was in charge of the National Cybersecurity Centre, we brought out what we called a board toolkit, which was these are the sorts of conversations that senior executives and non-executives, the chairs, the chief executives, the non-executive members, the finance directors, not the chief information security officer. These are the questions they need to ask the chief information security officer and understand. So the example I always use is that if you pay a company to send fake emails to all of the workers to see how many click on the dodgy link, do you know how to interpret the results? Because it's not a case of it was 20% last year and it's 10% this year, so that's great because we've halved the problem. The 10% could include the network administrators, which is a far worse problem than a 20% who don't. And I think you need that sort of richness. Exercising then is important, but I think there are two things there are two caveats I'd put on that. One is every exercise we did not match the subsequent crisis that followed it. The worst crisis we've already mentioned WannaCry in this discussion, Merle. And if you work in the United Kingdom, then an attack on the health service, the most important institution in the country, in the middle of a general election campaign, is as bad as it gets, short of actual sort of casualties and so on. And we certainly never thought that a North Korean ransomware attack would gone wrong and spreading all over the place would cause the biggest crisis. We were planning on something else. So I think, the exercise needs to be flexible enough that actually you're testing people's ability to respond rather than specifics, because very few of these major incidents have been the ones, if you look back at the books and articles written 10 years ago, I can't find predictions of WannaCry and NotPetya, but they were the two most difficult ones. So, and then the second thing is, I think we do need to pick realistic exercises. So again, no, I don't think we should exercise, all of the lights going out in a major city because, at least we shouldn't prioritize that, because that's not what the cyber attacks have been. And being a Riddite, if I can call myself that, I don't think that's likely to happen. And I recall talking to a senior executive of a major global financial institution who told me that the board of that institution had just done an away day exercising an attack where an unknown teenager had ransomware the entire bank, which could not operate any payments to other banks or to its own customers anywhere in the world, and was being ransomed for 3 billion, either, so as not to give it away, I will say $3 billion, euros or pounds, given that they're roughly comparable. And I said, but can you point me to an example of anything remotely like that ever happening in the world? And of course, the answer to that is no. I mean, a teenager shouldn't and can't really cripple a global financial institution in that way through ransomware. Whereas there are all sorts of other scenarios that board could usefully have role played. So, I think the thing about exercising is it should be part of a strategy that is realistic but flexible. But also, the most important thing is that the leaders are competent and conversant in good cybersecurity and understand how cyber risk fits into the wider organizational, or if it's in government, national objectives.
Cannot agree more, and well, I will agree with the point that an exercise scenario should be broad enough. You mentioned the importance of being able to ask the right questions, and I think that's very important. I think there is also the aspect of whether and how transparent the management, be it a management of a private company or the leadership of a country, how transparent the decision makers are about the situation at hand, and whether they decide to classify the information or whether they decide to share that information with the public and press. What do you think of that?
I think that in general, in almost all cases, you can always find an exception. Swift sharing of information and transparency about the event, both from the institution itself, but also from the government, is absolutely critical. One of the reasons the National Cybersecurity Centre was set up was because there was an attack which turned out to be not terribly significant on one of our major telcos in 2015. But because the government at the time did not have the same capability in public-facing cybersecurity as it does now, or that it does, say, for example, for pandemics with the chief medical officer, or for terrorist attacks with the senior police officer, or for floods with the head of the Environment Agency, there was seen to be a need, and there was large-scale public panic over this attack on this company, and lots of people thought the company had 4 million customers, so not a small company. And if you'd listened to the news that weekend, what was actually a low-level data theft sounded like all 4 million customers were at risk of having their bank accounts emptied imminently. Never true, but that's the story that took hold. So you need to reassure people sometimes. You need a function nationally that says, and I know Estonia has done this, because I remember when, for example, there was the flaw with the government digital services card. I remember talking to Estonian colleagues at the time, and they were doing exactly what we would do. Here's the risk. Here's the time frame over which it might be fixed. Here's what you are exposed to. Here's what you're not exposed to. Here are the things you can do to be to minimize the risk. That's good. That's good public safety advice, and there's definitely a role for that. Secondly, I think when I started, the then Prime Minister, Mr. Cameron, used to complain that we were perhaps the best students of cybersecurity in government, because we would have all this great intelligence and great analysis, but we would never be able to tell victims because it was all too classified. And so he eventually got very frustrated. Why are you briefing me on all these problems, congratulating yourself on your cleverness and skill in detecting the problems, but then not presenting any viable solutions by way of sharing, by way of remediation, and so on. So I think there is something in that. And then I think finally, there's just a boring but important technical point, which is that, it's not as if governments and, the actual companies themselves have a monopoly on cybersecurity information. There's loads of it. And it's a question of aggregating it well and getting the good stuff out. But it means that, frankly, genuinely classified cybersecurity information, there's not a great deal of it. You may think it's terribly sort of sensitive and secret, but often it's not. And so I think in the NCSC in the UK, we defaulted to transparency. I always worried, and I was clear with politicians on the risk. I said, if we default to transparency, we'll achieve a lot of good, but it's likely that something somewhere will go wrong, and it may be quite serious, and that's when we need your support. Luckily enough, it never happened, but I do think that's part of risk management on cybersecurity. You need to share information, including in the knowledge that it will go wrong at some point.
Thank you. Well, we are closely coming towards the end of our conversation, but extending on this transparency note, lastly, I wanted to ask you about attribution. When should states publicly attribute cyber intrusions? And this question has become increasingly important for decision making, partly due to the fact that it's growingly easier, I think, to attribute cyber attacks. And the UK has been, or it seems from where we are in Estonia, very, very open and transparent about it. But how hard do you think it is to attribute, and when should there be the public attribution?
It's a fascinating question. I'd love to know what you think. But I mean, firstly, there's a sort of technical and knowledge consideration, and then everything else subsequent to that. So the technical and knowledge base consideration is very obvious. In my 6.5 years running cybersecurity for the UK, I saw everything from one extreme, which is that we actually had video footage of a hacker, and we knew where he was always he. We knew where he lived, literally, knew the address, and we're watching him live. So from that level of confidence in one extreme, all the way through to a different level of confidence where there was a significant incident and we had literally no idea from which continent of the globe this was being done. And I saw pretty much everything in between in that spectrum. So obviously, if you're going to attribute, you need to be towards the former end of the spectrum than just throwing out wild allegations. So I do think the thresholds in terms of confidence levels are higher for governments, because governments matter, than they are for, say, cybersecurity companies writing reports. So that's the obvious point. But then I sort of default to attribution for a number of reasons, as in general a good thing. Its critics say, well, you attribute to China or Russia, and it doesn't stop China or Russia hacking. Well, of course not. But attribution can be a useful and incremental contributor to a response and to your overall cybersecurity in a number of ways. So firstly, diplomatic. It can apply diplomatic pressure. And I think if you saw the Obama administration's approach to Chinese hacking, it exposed Chinese hacking through attribution. It threatened sanctions. And then you had the extraordinary spectacle of a senior Chinese diplomat flying to Washington before a state visit by President Xi in September 2015 to sign an agreement that actually quietened Chinese cyber attacks for about 2 years. The UK got a similar agreement. Secondly, attribution can support criminal indictments. Now, the way the UK legal system works, it's very hard to indict people abroad who will never be extradited. But in the US, supporting those indictments in the US, it can be quite useful, because I think, being a state-sponsored hacker in China or Iran is quite a good job, and knowing that you can never travel to the West again is a bit of a disincentive to doing that. And I think there's some evidence, although it's quite hard to substantiate, that is that had some effect. It's less effective with Russia. It seems that Russians don't really care as much about attribution. However, one of the things we found in the NCSC was when you attribute, as we did after some of the Hague hacks and so forth, and some of the attacks on telecoms companies, when you attribute with technical detail, it's really, that gives your defenders something to go on. It says, look, this is what APT28 looks like in this particular case. So run these indicators through your systems, and if you find them, kick them out. And that's a very good practical case for attribution, because it makes the FSB's job harder, or whatever part of the Russian state it is, it makes their job harder because this set of indicators doesn't work. So those are up to 3 reasons why it can be a good idea to attribute. There's a final reason which is a bit quirky and personal to me. which is I'm a private citizen now, but I did spend quite a few years when there was a major cyber incident. The public accountability rested with me. And now I look at it from the other side and I think, well, from the point of view in a democracy, with accountable government, if there's a serious cybersecurity incident, if the person responsible for national cybersecurity is there on camera being asked, well, can you tell us who did this? And he or she either looks ignorant or evasive. It's not very good, actually. It was much better for me being able to say, yes, I do know that this attack probably came from the Russian state, and this is what that means, and so forth. Or this attack came from the Chinese state, or this is a criminal attack, likely from outside our borders and the borders of Europe, and so forth. I think there is something about reassuring the public that you know what's happening. So even that can be an argument for attribution in and of itself.
Well, thank you very much for a comprehensive answer on that. And truly, I think we could continue this conversation on any of these topics for hours, but the time presses us. So I really thank you for this conversation. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I look forward to other conversations, perhaps eye to eye in the future.
That would be lovely. Thank you so much for having me, Merle.